Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Christine, and thank you for coming back again to another of our Thinking Out of the Lunchbox talks. David Wasserstein is a medieval Jewish and Islamic historian. But beyond that, he's a man of many parts. Like myself, he's an Englishman with a DPhil from Oxford. He joined Vanderbilt 4 years ago from the University of Tel Aviv, and he's now Professor of History and the Eugene Greener Jr. Professor of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt. After his graduate work in Oxford, he taught in Dublin, and he's done research at prestigious institutes of higher learning right across Europe, especially in England, Germany, and Spain. He's written numerous scholarly articles and books, including The Rise and Fall of the Party Kings, Politics and Society in Islamic Spain, and The Caliphate in the West, an Islamic political institution in the Iberian Peninsula. And not long ago, he completed a book started by his father, Abraham Wasserstein, on the history of the legend of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible. But what, you might ask, does a medieval historian have to tell us today? Well, as you may know, some influential people like Harvard's Samuel Huntington have claimed that we in the West are faced with a clash of civilizations, with Islam as our main competitor. And certainly this is the way in which many political commentators tend to frame things. And even if these ideas are greatly exaggerated, there's no doubt that many peoples have very long memories, that under conditions of stress, religion takes on increasing importance in people's lives, and that Islam has ancient roots. If France and Britain and Germany, even in Turkey, in these countries there are major debates about whether Muslim women should be allowed, let alone required, to cover their faces in public, raising fundamental and complex questions about individual freedom and the public good. In France, for example, it is forbidden for young girls to wear head scarves at school, young Muslim girls. In Sweden, it's asserted as a right that they do that. Should we have just one law for all, or should we tailor our laws for different ethnic groups, different religious groups? If we take the second path, having different laws for different people, where are we going to end up? We're going to end up cutting off some people's hands, polygamy, stoning to death as acceptable alternative cultural practices. What can Europe's long-standing encounter with Islam teach us? Please join me in welcoming David Wasserstein, who will, I think, help us shed some light on these questions. David.
Thank you very much, David. This could easily be about the Crusades, nearly 1,000 years ago now, when Christian armies invaded the Islamic world, massacring Jews from the Rhineland to Jerusalem on the way to building a short-lived Christian state with a mainly Muslim population in the Holy Land. It could be about the effects of the Balfour Declaration less than 100 years ago, when a Christian empire laid one of the foundations for a Jewish state in the heart of the world of Islam. It could be about Britain's first humiliation in Iraq, in Kut al-Amara, when thousands of British, many of them Christian, soldiers surrendered to Muslim Turkish captivity during the First World War. It could be about Christian and Jewish traders from Western Europe in the Islamic Levant between the 16th and the 20th centuries, or about Muslim Barbary pirates descending out of the blue on Christian European shores from Italy to Iceland and seizing stunned, peaceful locals going about their business to sell as galley slaves in North Africa. And there's lots more. It could even be about Islam in Europe in the Middle Ages, when most of what later became, for the second time, Christian Spain and Portugal was Islamic. With a couple of fairly small exceptions, which I shall come to, none of this is my theme. Part of the reason why I could be talking about any or all of these is that Islam and Christendom have a long and intimate history. They go back a long way, further than might be thought. The first mosque in a Christian-ruled country was built in the 8th century in Constantinople, now Istanbul, though I have to admit that it's not known whether it was on the European side of the city or the Asiatic. That mosque was part of a peace settlement between the great Christian empire of Byzantium and the Muslim Arabs who were trying to conquer it as early as 718, less than a century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. We know about the mosque mainly from Arabic sources, a fact which might appear to cast doubt on its credibility as history. But we also hear about it in a work by a 10th century Byzantine emperor, Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, and that seems to set it on a firmer foundation. Byzantine agreement to its construction reflects an amazing and amazingly early decline in strength and prestige for this major power, and that should tell us something about how these two religions saw each other and about the realities of the relationship of these two great powers of the bipolar world of that time. Instead of rehearsing all these historical episodes, however, I want to look at a handful of extremely modern, contemporary examples of the meeting of Muslim and non-Muslim, mostly in the Christian world, and to ask why this encounter has apparently so often gone so disastrously wrong, and hence also to ask, perhaps implicitly, whether what happened was inevitable and whether it can or could go better. This is not to say that I have answers to these questions, but I think that they are more than worth asking, not just for Christendom and Christians, but in a more general sense for Westerners altogether, not least because of the separation both between church and state that is more and more the norm in the West, and between citizen and religion altogether. Let me begin, therefore, with some of the encounters themselves. They seem to me to be divisible into several categories. The first category is that of clashes involving one of the freedoms central to Western modernity, freedom of expression, including especially and virtually by definition the freedom to say things that other people may not like. As we know in this country and latterly also in Europe, this has come increasingly to be balanced against the need not to offend any group, something which can be very difficult. Thus, the famous Danish cartoons published in the newspaper Jyllands-Posten in September 2005 celebrated the right of citizens and the press freely to mock and make fun of religion, of those who believe in it, and of everything about it. At the same time, they also offended Muslims in several ways. First, they made fun of them. In itself, this need not have mattered. It is part, and I believe a healthy part, of living in a Western society that entire groups should occasionally find themselves victims of ridicule and satire. But they also mocked their faith and its founder. This was much more serious, both because of the insult to Muhammad and because of the infringement of the Islamic prohibition on images of the Prophet. Under Islamic law, insulting the Prophet is tantamount to blasphemy and punishable by death, and creating images of the Prophet, especially for the purpose of offering insult to him, as in the case of one cartoon which showed a figure, presumably Muhammad, with a bomb instead of a turban, simply adds injury to insult. But Denmark, I hear you thinking, is not an Islamic country, nor is it subject to Islamic law. The controversy that erupted was thus not a legal one, or at least not at first, but a social and a political one, both in Denmark and elsewhere. The Danish cartoons were reprinted several times in other newspapers in different countries, both as acts of solidarity with the perceived threat that suppressing them would pose to Western ideals of freedom of expression, and because they were thought to be quite amusing. In France, the cartoons were reprinted in a weekly called Charlie Hebdo, together with some new ones. The Danish ones are, in fact, as one of those who felt reluctantly obliged to defend them pointed out, not really very funny. Though, of course, that should not be part of any argument for prohibiting their publication on religious grounds. The French ones are not much better. In France, unlike in Denmark, however, two Muslim organizations went to court against Charlie Hebdo, accusing it of publicly abusing a group of people because of their religion. And the result was an acquittal in spring of last year for the magazine and its publishers. That, of course, was not the only end of the story, for Iran had taken up the insult and said that what was sauce for the goose should be sauce also for the gander, and offered prizes of some $12,000, which was a lot of money there, for cartoons about the Holocaust, seeing that as a matter of similarly deep sensitivity for Christian Westerners, and one also that had the great advantage of hitting two birds with a single stone, for Jews or Zionists could be offended at the same time. The Iranian cartoons, I have to say, were even less funny than the Danes. They can be seen on the web if you look, and they are also deeply offensive, and maybe thus raise the real issue in a direct way. Are there limits to freedom of expression that go beyond the accepted ones of shouting fire in a crowded theatre, as happened in this very city last summer, and broadcasting child pornography on the internet? And if there are, how do we marry those limits to the genuine exercise of the freedom itself? If Islam is to be protected in a special way, is Christianity? Is Judaism to be protected too? And then, what of religion in general? And then, indeed, what of atheism? Alternatively, if there are no such limits, then, again, what about child pornography and shouting fire? This is not very different from the uproar in Germany in September 2006 over the need that was felt to cancel a production of Mozart's opera Idomeneo, in which the head of Muhammad, together with heads of Buddha, Jesus, and Poseidon, incidentally the only one of the four who is actually a character in the opera, were to be shown on stage. Cancelled that September because of the controversy which it aroused, the opera was put on without any problems at all 3 months later, in January of last year. This incident in its turn is not dissimilar to the Pope's famous faux pas about Islam, also September 2006. In a lecture at Regensburg University in Germany, where he had once been a professor, the Pope quoted from a work in medieval Greek by the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II Palaeologus. I'm sure you all know 1391 to 1425. I have to look it up. From a discussion held, possibly in reality, between that ruler and an educated Persian. The emperor there says, "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached." Of course, this was only an obscure quotation from an even more obscure medieval scholar-ruler, though its contents have many analogues in the practice of many faiths. Both medieval emperor and modern pope, among others, would have done well to look in the mirror. But it set off a tremendous reaction all over the Muslim world and led indirectly to the murder of a Christian nun in Somalia and the execution of 3 Christians, leaders of a Christian militia in Indonesia, who would probably have been spared that penalty if things had been quieter. We also have the case of a French high school teacher, Robert Rodecker, who had to go into hiding, same time, September 2006, when he published a newspaper commentary in Le Figaro, the respected right-wing French paper, criticizing Muhammad and Islam. And finally, because I don't want this list to go on too long, there is the famous case of Theo van Gogh, who was murdered in Holland in November 2004 because a film he had made was thought to have insulted Islam. All these cases constitute one category. My second category is very different. Here we have the long-running saga, mentioned by David a moment ago, of the veil and its acceptability in schools and in other public institutions in France. We have the permissibility of the veil in schools in Germany, and now also in the UK, though just over a year ago in the UK it was announced that schools are to be allowed to forbid the wearing of veils that cover the face. In case any of you don't know this, I should explain that there are different kinds of veils and veiling. There's the niqab, khimar, burqa, hijab, chador, and they cover different parts and proportions of the female body. And there are different traditions and customs related to veiling in different parts of the Islamic world. More shocking somehow than all this is the question of sacrifices. At the end of Ramadan, the breaking of the fast is celebrated by every head of household with the sacrifice of a sheep. These animals have to be slaughtered in a special way and in public. I vividly remember the fuss that this caused in France when I was there some years ago, partly because of animal rights campaigners who were against it in principle, partly on account of those who were for permitting it, but only in private and under laws strictly governing the application of humane and modern methods of slaughter. And finally, the case reported in the Sunday papers last March, just a year ago, of the German judge who refused to grant a Muslim woman a divorce more quickly than normal because she was afraid of violence from her husband, on the ground that the Quran sanctions such violence if the wife does not obey the husband. The judge was removed from the case with remarkable, and it must be said commendable, rapidity, but the issue here is similar too. These are two different categories. Both involve granting special status in terms of Western societies and how they treat their citizens. But they are different categories. The first involves the granting of special status to Islam in respect of the behavior and speech of non-Muslims. In simple terms, limitations on what non-Muslims may say and how they may react to Islam and to different aspects and manifestations of it. It affects Muslims only indirectly, and its essential target is non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, as well as atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, Hindus, pagans, others. The second category affects Muslims much more directly, and it concerns how they are to behave in their relations with non-Muslims in societies dominated by non-Muslims and ruled by non-Islamic law. May Muslim women be compelled not to wear the veil because non-Islamic law or custom or security needs require it? A recent decision, last September, by Canadian elections commissioners will allow Muslim women to veil their faces when voting, with clear implications for identification and hence also for security. In both sets of cases, however, the central issue is a demand for a special status for Islam and or Muslims in non-Islamic contexts. Sometimes the real nature of the demand is not so clear, to us or even perhaps to those making it. Just a few months ago, again, September seems to be a popular month here, in September of last year, the Hustler, for those of you who are under the false impression, I should stress that's the Vanderbilt Hustler. There is apparently another publication of the same name. The Vanderbilt Hustler, established in 1888, published an article by a Muslim, Dawood Muhammad, asking that we, quote, let secularism deal with the problems of secularism and let religion deal with the problems of religion. There's a curious echo here, perhaps, of Matthew 22:21. Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. This lofty recommendation, however, was somewhat obscured by the main thrust of the article, which was to attack homosexuality. It's a perversion, the man wrote. It involves filthiness. It has a negative effect on the birth rate. It's unfair to women. If you allow it, lots of men will go off and do it. And it was not clear how the author's solution, elegant, if not perhaps thought very far through, would actually deal with what he sees as a very serious problem. Where do these demands come from? Whence do they derive their strength? Many of these Muslim reactions to the non-Islamic world seem to issue from a profound defensiveness, from an excess of sensitivity to what most non-Muslims see as harmless matters of no great importance. The retreat or the separation of the religious from the public space in European countries, and to a great extent also here in the USA, explains much of this. So too does the position of Islam in Europe and in the USA today. Unlike in the past, Muslims in Western Europe are now vast in numbers, 3 to 4 millions in Germany, probably some 5 to 6 millions in France, perhaps 2 millions in the United Kingdom, with similar proportions in other European countries, 1 million each in Spain and Italy and Holland, both Denmark and Sweden, more than 250,000, leading to a total for Western Europe alone of something approaching 15 to 18 million Muslims. Colonial pasts, post-war economic needs, as in Germany, leading to the importation of Gastarbeiter, guest workers in huge numbers, liberal admissions policies for refugees, all have brought masses of Muslims to Europe. These immigrants, and still more their children, fill the banlieue of Paris and Marseille, the slums of Hamburg and Berlin, the quiet suburbs of Manchester and London and Leicester, where I grew up, with Muslims who are rooted in European societies. And they are beginning to realize their strength, even if sometimes it is a strength that emerges through weakness. I think here not only of the riots that have shaken Paris over the last couple of years, given more resonance by the election of Nicolas Sarkozy, notorious for advocating a tough response to the rioters, as President of France in May last year, but also of the homegrown terrorism that Europe has had to face and that occasionally surfaces here too. The New York Times reported last September that European countries now face an urgent need to increase legal immigration to maintain their workforces and sustain their pension systems, and that is likely to come in large part from Islamic countries. In France, some people have begun to claim that that country will, by the middle of this century, thanks to Muslim birth rates and the notorious native non-Muslim French unwillingness to procreate, have a Muslim majority. It is unlikely, but that this can be predicted is in itself significant. What Muslims failed to do by force of arms in the 8th century, one might say, they may achieve peacefully in the 21st. Here in the USA, Muslim numbers are far smaller, at something like 6 to 8 millions or fewer, and they are growing at a far slower rate. But there are already more Muslims than, for example, Jews, and it can be only a matter of time before they become a lot more visible. A further element in any explanation must be the immediate situation of Islam in the world, and even more, Muslims' perceptions of that. We can ignore the Crusades. They took place a long time ago, as they say. But for over 200 years now, Islam, Islamic states, the Islamic world as a whole is seen to have been under attack ever since Napoleon's short-lived conquest of Egypt in 1798 inaugurated an age of European invasion, domination, and exploitation of almost the entire Islamic world. Only Iran escaped direct foreign Christian rule, though not division into foreign so-called spheres of influence, and together with Iran, what is now Turkey. Everywhere else was ruled by Christians, and even Turkey and Iran were, as they remain, heavily affected by Christian cultures and ideas. This has come to a head now with what is widely perceived by Muslims as Christian, in particular American, Western invasion of a sovereign Islamic country without international sanctions through the United Nations, and an apparent division of the world by Christian states into what I might call the West and the rest. This is the third category of encounters between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the world. Like the rest, it has a long history. But today, because of the experience of the past 2 centuries, perception of it by Muslims is more acute and possibly more dangerous than ever before. It expresses itself in the rhetoric and the nuclear ambitions of President Ahmadinejad of Iran, as we have seen and heard even in the last week with his use of expressions like cancerous germ, in the refusal of Hamas and Hezbollah to treat with Israel and the West more generally without violence, in what people in this country still persist in calling insurgents and IEDs in Iraq. But if the patterns are the patterns of earlier centuries, the stakes are, of course, now much higher. Finding a cheaper alternative to oil will not solve these difficulties. The more distant history of Islam has something to offer here, too. The laws of Islam that Westerners are so often accused of breaking, the insults offered to Muhammad, for example, or the creation of images of the Prophet, are, of course, not laws for non-Muslims. They are not laws in the states where these people live, and they are not part of any legal system that they have acquiesced in or can be seen as part of, individually or as groups. They come from a society or a set of societies in which they were formed very early, at a time when first Islam was in process of coming into being and felt a need to be defensive, and second, Islam was nonetheless the dominant force in its own world and in control of the way in which such matters were arranged. It needed to be. And the growth of the Islamic empire so rapidly made it possible for Muslims to see their world, much as Romans had seen their world, and as some Americans still see theirs, as equivalent to the whole world. This helped the notion that their laws enjoyed, or should enjoy, universal application, regardless of whether Islam ruled in a particular place or not. The real world, of course, isn't like that. And in one sense, it's easy to argue that all of this is just part of the many ways in which Muslims everywhere, both in the Christian West and especially in the Islamic world itself, are having to come to terms with modernity, with the freedoms of westernization, and the demands that these impose upon those who enjoy them. This is what is reflected, I think, in that young man who wrote the article about homosexuality in the Vanderbilt Hustler that I quoted a few minutes ago. And that, indeed, is the basic message of such modernists as the Canadian Muslim Irshad Manji, who spoke here at Vanderbilt a couple of years ago. She writes, in a book pregnantly entitled The Trouble with Islam, "If ever there was a moment for an Islamic reformation, it's now. For the love of God, what are we doing about it?" And clearly there's something in that. But is it enough? I said at the start that this was not going to be about the Crusades, and as you see, it hasn't been. But in one respect, the Crusades fit in here very well. What I have been suggesting is that, in part at least, this is more a dispute about perspective, about the different ways in which Muslims and Christians, Muslims and Westerners look at things, not about the things themselves. The Crusades offer a good case in point. When President Bush so famously used the word crusade some years ago in referring to what has become known as the War on Terror, all he meant was a serious attempt to achieve a generally desired goal. That is all the word means in this sort of context in English today. What he was understood to be talking about, however, by many Muslims who saw the etymology of the word in real terms was something like the Old Crusades, a violent incursion into lands that had been Muslim for hundreds of years. Though it is worth remembering that in the Middle Ages, at the time of the real Crusades, Muslims did not see these movements as anything other than a sideshow in the local politics of the time, a series of invasions that certainly disturbed but had little significant meaning for Muslims of the time. So little meaning, in fact, that they did not understand the religious and the ideological background to them and had no word for crusade or crusader until the 19th or even the 20th century. At the time, Christians thought it vital to rescue the Holy Land from the Muslim infidel. Today, Muslims see the Crusades as the harbingers of 19th and 20th century Western imperialism, Zionist colonialism, and the oil that they have found themselves largely unable to exploit successfully, whether for political aims abroad or for social and economic advances at home. Neither medieval Christians' ideological understanding nor contemporary Muslims' historical analysis, however, justifies the use of the expression David mentioned before, a clash of civilizations, in my view. In the Middle Ages, the battle lines between crusader and local were not simply those between Christian and Muslim. They were far more complex, with Muslims and Christians often on the same side, facing up against other Christians or Muslims. Similarly, Muslim relations with Jews in the Middle Ages, if complex, were in our terms surprisingly positive. As I have argued elsewhere, Islam saved the Jews, medieval Islam. Samuel Huntington's famous, if largely unread, book and its even more famous title have the immense attraction of simplicity, Clash of Civilizations. But the real world is not simple. States today, as in the Middle Ages, do not have friends. They have interests, as Bismarck famously put it. As in the Middle Ages, there is no necessary clash today between Christianity or Christendom and Islam as such. The prescriptions of do-gooding peace lovers, as of terrorist ideologues and their disciples, bespeak idealism more than realism. Politics cannot be a game of sentiment, but at the same time, the real world demands serious political thinking and real solutions. Have I got time to end with a little anecdote? I began by mentioning the first mosque in a European state, in Constantinople, now called Istanbul. There is no trace of that mosque today, and the greatest building in Istanbul is the Hagia Sophia Church, converted into a mosque following the city's conquest by Islam in 1453, and now, in secular Turkey, a museum. A few decades after 1453, in 1492, following the Christian reconquest of Granada in Spain, the Jews were expelled from Spain, where they had enjoyed a true golden age for centuries, and many of them found refuge under Islamic rule in Istanbul and elsewhere in the Ottoman Near East. In Spain itself, at the other end of the Mediterranean, the greatest building, or one of the greatest, is the beautiful mosque in Córdoba, converted into a church after the Christian reconquest of that city in 1236, and now a cathedral. In recent years, groups of Muslims in Spain, North African immigrants and local converts to Islam, have sought permission to worship in that building as Muslims, like their ancestors of yore. Their desire has been rejected by the church, partly because it sees the request as the thin end of a very long wedge, and partly, as it has pointed out, because the mosque itself was actually an intruder built on the site of a far older church. The Muslims, or their sympathizers, for their part, see the building as symbolic of far more than simply a locale for worship. They have, after all, plenty of places if they need to find somewhere to pray. For them, it represents much more than that. When I visited Cordoba a few years ago, I found one of the old exterior walls of the mosque compound covered with graffiti in Arabic. In their different ways, the graffiti expressed the link that these local Muslims felt with the place. The graffiti themselves were concerned with a great variety of subjects. There were expressions like Allah, the word for God, Islam, Algeria. This was at the time of the terrible massacres that were taking place in that country in the Civil War, just at that time. Politics and religion, above all. But what jumped out from them, I thought, was less their content than the fact of their location, written by otherwise rather mute and helpless Muslims on the wall of this great Islamic monument, both to God and to Islamic power in a Christian environment.
So much, David. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions and then we'll open the discussion to the floor. I'm thinking about defensiveness. I was reminded only last week in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury said that he thought that, and this is paraphrasing, that some element of Sharia law was going to have to become part of the British legal system. And there was an extraordinary outcry and people calling for his resignation and so on and so on. I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts about what was going on in his mind and whether there was a kind of defensiveness in the reaction to his remarks.
I think there's certainly defensiveness in the reaction to his remarks. I think what was going on in his mind was two things. Firstly, I think he is...
Just speak a bit closer.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me? No?
No, they want to just speak a bit closer.
No? Yeah. Right. I think there was certainly something of the defensive in his in reactions to what the Archbishop said. But more importantly, I think it's interesting to look at what he said. In his speech, he was arguing, as you said, that there is a case for introducing certain aspects of Sharia law, and he stressed not the horrific things that fill the cheaper newspapers, like cutting people's hands off or stoning women and so on, but rather arrangements for marriage and for inheritance and things like that, which are not in themselves in any necessary conflict with Western laws. But he was doing this partly, I think, because he thought it might be a good thing, and partly for another reason, and that's the reason I mentioned, the fact that in England, as in other Western countries, numbers of Muslims are now enormous. We're not talking about very small numbers of people who are easily assimilated or assimilable into Western systems and customs with regard to things like inheritance and marriage. We're talking about very large numbers of people for whom he believes these are very important matters. And he thinks that the customs of such groups cannot be changed easily overnight, even in the medium term, to those of British society. He may be right, he may be wrong. But the reactions to what he said, and I should stress one more thing, the reaction to what he said were very strong and in many ways very defensive. Defensive, perhaps, in a good sense. There are Britons who want to maintain British traditions and British society as they are. But he gave another speech a few days later in reaction to the reactions, and in that speech he watered down what was already a rather watered down proposal, and if you read what he said in the second speech with some care, you see that in fact he's now proposing rather less than he was proposing before. He's really saying, let's be nice to non-Christians or non-atheists in British society, which is all very well, but doesn't take you very far towards incorporating any other kind of laws into British legal structures.
Well, let me ask you another question. And this is a bit like confession. I don't know if my reactions are just unique to me, but when I think of satirical magazines, I think of cartoons, my first reaction is, anything goes. I like the idea that there are no sacred cows. Which is an odd expression to use. That anything can be made fun of. And I think this may be just in part, the British skeptic in me that really doesn't take anything too seriously and just thinks anything is perfectly okay in terms of making fun of it. I remember someone told me a child molester joke the other day, and I just thought, this was awful, but it was terribly funny. I told you, confession. So when I think about making fun of Muhammad or the image of Muhammad, there's a part of me that thinks, well, they've just got to get used to this. This is just the way we in the West operate. But there's another part of me that thinks, well, maybe we've lost something too, and we can't respect. There are things that need to be respected, and if we just think we can make fun of everything, haven't we lost something too? And I'm just wondering whether this attitude, you think about the late night shows on TV. We can all laugh and enjoy it, but every so often that goes a bit too far. Or that's treading a bit too close to the line. Do you think there is a value here in this that's worth defending, as it were, all the way? This sense that anything can be said, and it's actually all right to offend people, because it's important to be able to say things even when they offend people.
I'm torn here between the desire to answer the question and the desire to ask you for the child molester joke, but I'll contain myself and wait till afterwards for the joke, I'm afraid. There are important values here, I think. Yes, I think there are very important values. There are values which lie at the root of what modern society, modern Western societies is and are about. But I think there's more to it than that. I think the fact that we can make fun of things is in itself important. The fact that we can make fun of things which are set over us is also very important. I think the fact that we are the products of a tradition which goes back for more than 2,000 years of satire and jokes and comedy and mockery is itself something very, very healthy. There's no need to interpret satire, there's no need to interpret mockery as a signal of lack of respect. There's no need to think that a priest who makes a joke about Jesus, and there are plenty who do, is therefore indicating his lack of respect for his Savior. There's no need to think that a rabbi who makes a joke about kosher food is therefore indicating his lack of respect for the tradition which he, I hesitate to say incarnates, but that he represents. Mockery and satire are a healthy part of any civilized society. The problem comes, as I indicated, the problem comes when we try to set limits, to say this far and no further. It's very difficult. Can one make a joke about Jesus? Well, clearly one can, and one does. Can one make a joke about something that is outside one's own tradition? There seems to be no good reason why not, except that it may offend some people. But it's the character of satire, it's the essence of satire and of mockery that it will offend. Offence, I believe, is something we have to learn to live with. I grew up suffering that kind of offence. I'm sure you did. And I'm sure most people in this room have grown up suffering various kinds of offence in the form of mockery and satire. Mockery and satire don't need to indicate disrespect for me or for my traditions. They don't need to indicate disrespect for or insult to the traditions of others. They are part of the world we live in, and they're a very valuable part of the world we live in. It's not just a question of Saturday Night Live and the Colbert Report, which I also love.
I suppose the point that you were making before is still valid, though, that if you are part or seem to be part of a group that has traditionally exercised power or have actually been in a dominant position in relation to another culture, making jokes about that other culture may seem to be, as it were, part of this general and maybe historical and willingness to exploit and to deal very negatively and punitively with that other culture. So the joke may be be seen as symptomatic of something deeper and greater, and that may be why it's hard simply to treat it as another joke.
That's absolutely true. As you can hear, and as you've heard, David and I both grew up in England. We now live in this country, and as I said before, it can be very difficult not to give offence to whole groups. It's very difficult. It's easy to make a joke about child molesters for some reason, but it's very difficult to make jokes about Jews or black people or other people who are traditional victims of oppression in this country. It's easier in other countries, but in this country we are all very concerned about not offending such groups. And we should be concerned, I believe, not to offend other people unnecessarily. But this does not mean accepting all the rules and all the strictures that are internal to a foreign society and adopting them as part of our own society with regard simply to one group and one group only in our own society. Our own society has to have freedoms for all, or in the end it will have freedoms for none.
Okay, we're going to go back to the president and ask for some questions for David to write down, and then he's going to answer them all. Okay, this gentleman here? Yeah.
Coming home from Dixon yesterday, I saw a Confederate battle flag flying in the yard, and it reminded me of how badly we need to forget some things here. And you started your message off by saying, we can forget the Crusade. The question is, will they? And the other question is, should we begin to sell bumper stickers in that part of the world?
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman here, and then a lady in blue.
It seems to me that around 1800, Europe, and increasingly here, got over the religious filter on life, and it became more beside the point. We had more scientific, intellectual freedoms, lots of different kind of filters. Do I understand that the old Ottoman Empire and the whole Muslim world had much more of a strict theological filter? But it seems like every time you talk, it came down to a religious type of thing, more than these other more important things.
Okay, lady here and then the gentleman back there.
Okay. I'm Christian, but I was intensely interested in when you said there were 6 8 million Islamics here and that they already outnumber the Jewish population? Okay. In the future, do you foresee some kind of tinkering with our Constitution to solve this problem that might arise, or do you foresee the need for a committee on committees to get together and appoint various committees to come and try to mediate angry feelings before we have to go to the legislature and say blah, blah, blah? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's David over there.
You spoke about the professor who spoke at Vanderbilt last year, I think he said, or 2 years ago, who said it was a great time now to get together. And I just read that people who speak about Islam becoming either less violent or more into today's modernity are being called revisionists. And I wonder if that would be what she was talking about. Revisionism is what I read anyway.
I'm not changing the subject, but I am a Muslim. I was born a Muslim. And
Can you turn on the mic?
Turn it toward you.
okay. I have never felt any discrimination between Christian, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim in my whole life, till lately after September 11th. And I want to clarify one point about the different cover-ups. Islam does not tell you to cover your face or anything. Islam tells you to dress moderately, like all Jews and Christians and Muslims dressed in the old days, when you covered your head, when you go to church, when you wore a decent-looking outfit, whatever you want to describe as decent. But lately, unfortunately, after September 11th, the Islamic religion, the Muslim religion, I should say, has been butchered and hijacked to no end. We are all God's people. I respect everybody, at least for me, I respect everybody for what they are. You were brought up as a Jewish because your parents were. They were evangelists because their parents are. And now with this latest election, what bugs me the most, Obama denied he was a Muslim. So what? Obama raised himself from nothing to somebody. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lady back there.
I was wondering to what extent you think the customs and traditions, I guess, of other religions should be respected. I'm sorry, I said respect again, within the law. Like, I think we would all agree that to some extent you do need to accommodate all religions and make people feel safe and welcomed, etc. But at what point should that stop? And like you said, we shouldn't try and make all these special rules for just one group, but at what point do we stop accommodating them?
Okay, thank you. I think we got two more questions, one over here and then gentleman at the front here.
Yes, this is not to change the subject again, but again, freedom of speech should be with responsibility. This is the most important thing. I was very offended. I'm a Muslim. I was born a Muslim. I'm going to die as a Muslim. And I was offended very, very strongly a few days ago when somebody was saying in my presence, Jesus Christ was born out of wedlock. In other words, he was not a normal human being. I said, hey, what? Don't you ever dare say that. Because Jesus Christ is very holy. And we in Islam accept Christianity, Judaism as divine religions. We have no objection whatsoever to any of these divine religions. However, Osama bin Laden, what he did September 11th was very wrong. And we are now paying the price for it. And religion, Islam is indeed being targeted as being a terrorist and a violent religion, and it's not. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our last question here.
One comment. I think our country was born out of oppression and born from being oppressed because of religion, because of the way we thought. There's no freedom, and so when people came here, our Constitution is based on giving as much freedom as possible. As far as satire, I want to make one comment. I think the master of satire is George Carlin, because nobody is spared from George Carlin's wit. And he really has the ability to go a lot of matters.
Thank you.
Well, that was a very interesting group of questions, and some of them were comments, I think, rather than questions, but I'll see if I can respond to them all very quickly. The first gentleman was talking about the need to forget, which I thought was talking about the Confederate flag and bumper stickers. I'm afraid I didn't catch which particular bumper stickers he was talking about, but I think it's important also to distinguish between different kinds of remembering. I think it's important to remember, for example, the Confederate past. That isn't to say that we should honor the Confederate past, and particularly those aspects of it which are dishonorable to the Constitution of the United States of America that the other gentleman just now mentioned. The Confederacy is part of this country's history, and we should know about it. I think it's very important, particularly if we are in a territory which was once part of the Confederacy, as I believe this state may have been. No, it's not. It is. So we should certainly know about it. But there are, but societies.
He's a medieval historian.
Thank you very much. But remembering our past or your past does not mean identifying with particular characters in it, and that's, I think, very important. The next gentleman asked whether there's a religious filter on Islamic life. Is there a strict theological filter? I think it's important to say something very important about Islam, and I'm sorry that the lady and gentleman who are sitting here have now left. Islam is no more a unity. There's no more one single Islam than there is one single Christianity. There are members of many different kinds of Christian sect or group in this room, I'm sure. Members of many different Muslim sects and groups in this country and in the world. Islam is no more a unity than is Christianity. We have Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe. We have the wee frees of the Reverend Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland, who are very, very puritanical. We have the riotous Roman Catholics in Rio de Janeiro. Nobody's going to tell me that they all agree about everything, Christian or other. And the same is true of Muslims. Muslims come in all shapes and sizes in terms of theology, in terms of belief, and in terms of practice. Osama bin Laden is representative of something in Islam, but so are many other different kinds of people in the great umbrella that is Islam, and we shouldn't forget that. Islam is one of the great civilizations in world history. It fills, if you like, the historical space between the ancient world and the great developments of the late medieval world in Europe. We should not forget that. I don't think we're going to have to tinker with the Constitution in this country. You have a genius for committees on committees, and I think the Constitution is best left alone. Irshad Manji, the person I mentioned, who called for reformation now in Islam, there's somebody over there asking about Islam becoming less violent, and did I mean that when I spoke about revisionists? No, I didn't. I meant that Islam, according to Irshad Manji, stands in need of development in the way that Christianity has done, has undergone change and development and is undergoing change and development. Islam is moving forward and is changing in many different ways in many different parts of the world. People like Osama bin Laden perhaps represent resistance to change and resistance to modernity. They do not represent Islam as such. But that brings me to the lady at the back who was asking how far should we respect other customs, other peoples and religions, customs and traditions in terms of law. This is a function not, I believe, of the regulation by other people's customs and religions. It's a function of the civilized character of a civilized society. A civilized society tolerates what it tolerates, and it tolerates a good deal. A society like this, the one we have in this country, can tolerate a very great deal without incorporating Islamic law and Islamic tradition into the law of the United States of America. And it will change as it is changing. It has changed backwards and forwards on issues like murder, punishment for murder. It's changing backwards and forwards on issues like abortion. And this is part of the life of a healthy society, that it thinks about issues and it develops its attitudes and its reactions to issues, and it decides how and how again to deal with particular issues. And I think that's something that you can leave to a civilized society to do in ways that work out best for that society. The gentleman over here who's now left talked about the necessity for responsibility together with freedom, exercising freedom with responsibility. He's absolutely right. I'm not saying that in a free society we should go out and say kill Muslims any more than in Germany it would have been right to say kill Jews. It is right, on the other hand, for people here in this country to be able to say we are not Muslims, we are not bound by Muslim law, and we are bound by the law of the United States of America, and we are entitled to the freedoms that the gentleman over there mentioned a moment ago about what we may do with our freedoms. We don't want to offend people, we don't want to insult people, and we don't want to bring people down. But we should be able to make jokes. And I think jokes are, in the end, what it's all about. We should be able to laugh not just at ourselves, but also at other people. Thank you.
Just perfect. Great. Just what the doctor ordered.